Welcome back to our weekly mini Parsha Shir on Sefer or Gedalyahu, the commentary of Rav Gedalyahu Shor on the Parsha. As I've mentioned in the past, I'll try to record this mini Shir each week and to be able to email it out along with our Shabbat sheet, which is usually emailed out on Thursday afternoon or Thursday evening. A reminder that you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel and by doing so get automatic updates when these videos are loaded. Today, I would like to examine one particular comment the Or Gedalyahu makes on the very first pasuk in the parsha this week, which is Parshat Toldot. The first pasuk of the parsha presents us with a very extreme and blatant redundancy. The pasuk says, "Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holid es Yitzchak." These are the generations, the descendants of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. By the way, Avraham bore Yitzchak. Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. Why does the pasuk need to tell us that Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak when the Torah already said just a couple of words earlier that Yitzchak is the son of Avraham? It's obvious that Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. Why does the Torah have to repeat itself? The Mefarshim I'll struggle to understand this, and I think come up with some actually very interesting ideas of perhaps why this redundancy is placed here in the Torah. The Ramban, for example, says that the redundancy stems really from a comment in a pasuk in last week's parsha, where the descendants of Ishmael are outlined. That section of the parsha begins with the words "Ve'ela Toldos Yishmael ben Avraham." And the Ramban says, "She'im Amar Gam Kein Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak ben Avraham Bilvad." If in our parsha we began to talk about the descendants of Yitzchak with the exact same phrase, mirroring the pasuk about Ishmael in last week's parsha, and that's all it said, "Ela Toldos Ishmael ben Avraham, Ela Toldos Yitzchak ben Avraham, Hine Hishva Shneim Biyichus Uvemala." We might mistakenly think that these two lineages, these two sets of descendants, are equal in our eyes in terms of yichus and in terms of importance. And of course, that's not the case. The Torah specifically wants to hone our attention on the descendants of Yitzchak, because it's through Yitzchak and his descendants that the family heritage of Avraham Avinu and eventually the Jewish people would be passed on. And therefore, in order to differentiate between the generations of Ishmael in last week's parsha, the generations of Yitzchak in this week's parsha, the Torah not only says Ela Toldos Yitzchak ben Avraham, but reinforces, by the way, Avram holid es Yitzchak. This is the main descendants that were chosen to be the progenitors of Avram's family and the Jewish people, the descendants specifically of Yitzchak. The Chizkuni comes up with actually three very interesting answers to the question about the redundancy, which are different than the Ramban. The Chizkuni begins by telling us that not everywhere where it says Ben in the Torah, Yitzchak ben Avraham, does Ben actually signify the child of somebody. Perhaps Ben just means that the child was raised in the person's home. So Yitzchak ben Avraham could just mean that Yitzchak was raised in the home of Avraham. And of course that's important for us to know as we discuss the character of Yitzchak and later his descendants, to know that they were raised in the home infused with the values of Avraham Avinu, etc. The second half of the pasuk is not telling us he was raised in his home. Avram holid es Yitzchak. It's telling us that not only was he raised there, but he was actually the biological child of Avraham as well. In the second answer, the Chizkuni says it's to emphasize to us Avraham holid es Yitzchak, velo Avram holid es Yitzchak. Yitzchak was born to Avram after Avram had undergone the change where Hashem makes his name Avraham instead of Avram, adding the hey to his name, signifying the closeness and the relationship and the bris that Avram had come into with Hashem, telling us that Yitzchak is born into a milieu in his home where there's already a very strong spiritual presence, where Avram had reached kind of the peak of his relationship with God, and that's the environment into which Yitzchak was born. He not only was the child of this man, Avraham, but specifically born in the stage of life of Avraham and Sarah, and not Avram and Sarai. Lastly, the Chizkuni suggests that Yitzchak ben Avraham is a fact. It's a point of information. The Torah is telling us the generations of Yitzchak are going to be Yaakov and Esav. But before that, we need to know where Yitzchak came from. He came from Avraham. But the second piece of the pasuk, Avram holid es Yitzchak, is there in order to tell us that not only was Yitzchak the child of Avraham, but he was a child that Avram could be proud of. He quotes the pasuk in Mishlei, Ateres Zekenim b'nei banim. that Avram could be proud not only of Yitzchak, his child, but of his grandchildren, and that it was not only a relationship of father-son, but of proud father-son, of proud of what Yitzchak would accomplish in his life and had already accomplished in his life, etc. But by far, perhaps the most famous, well-known answer to the redundancy of the Parsha is the one that's quoted by Rashi from the Medrash. Rashi says, Al Yadesha Kasav HaKasav Yitzchak ben Avram. Once the Pasuk said that Yitzchak is the son of Avraham, Huskak Lomar Avraham Holid es Yitzchak. The Torah was required to point out that Avraham literally bore Yitzchak, that they were biologically related. Why? Lefi shahayu leitzanei hador omrim. The mockers of the generation of Avraham used to say, it was very well known, Me'avimelech nis abra Sarah. They didn't believe that Yitzchak was necessarily the child of Avram, or they wouldn't believe that Yitzchak was actually the child of Avram. They know that Avram and Sarah had difficulty having children, and then all of a sudden they see them go down to Gerar, and Avimelech abducts Sarah into his palace. And the next thing you know, they leave, and Avram and Sarah get a news that they're going to have a child, and then Yitzchak is born. They could assume that perhaps Sarah got pregnant while she was in Gerar with Avimelech. So in order to counter that claim and really make an emphasis of the fact that Avraham and Sarah together bore Yitzchak, Ma'asa Kadosh Baruch Hu, what did Hashem do? Tsar klaster panav shel Yitzchak domeh le'Avram. He made sure that Yitzchak would look very similar in his face to Avraham Avinu. And by doing so, everyone will recognize that they were biologically related. And that's what the Pasuk's trying to tell us. Yitzchak ben Avram, Yitzchak was the child of Avraham. Not only was he the child of Avraham, but Avram holed its Yitzchak. It was evident to everybody. It was abundantly clear that they were father and son because they looked so similar in terms of their visual appearance. The Gedalyahu says there's actually a deeper level to this Pasuk, to this Medrash, to this Rashi, which we just quoted. And he tells us that what the Torah is conveying here in Avram Holid es Yitzchak is not only that they looked similar in the physical sense, but they looked similar in the spiritual sense as well. Their personality and their spiritual makeup was similar. Avram Holid es Yitzchak. Avraham's spiritual persona was transferred over to his child Yitzchak. On the surface, that's actually a very jarring and surprising statement because we know that the spiritual and personality heritage of Avram and Yitzchak was actually known to be quite different. You see this in examples in the stories of their lives and in the Psukim, but also in many Mamarei Chazal. Avram is classically associated with the Midah, the trait of Chesed, the trait of Ahava, of love. He was a person who was outgoing, who was giving, who was an extrovert, who was connected to people. His personality of chesed was an expansive one. He was constantly going out of himself in his life and in his spiritual pursuits. He was the one that went out of himself to gather in many different people to the faith of monotheism, etc. Whereas Yitzchak, by contrast, was known to have a spiritual makeup of midas hagvura, of the trait of gvura, the trait of din, the trait not of ava, but of yira, of fear of God. He was a person who was more introverted, who was more internal, who was known to retreat rather than to expand, as opposed to Avram Avinu. So how could it be that the Gedalyahu says that the two are related in terms of their spiritual makeup? The Gedalyahu, quoting really from the Ramban and also from the Sfas Emes, says that while it may be counterintuitive, we could actually claim that in the realm of spirituality, Ahava and Chesed, love and kindness, are not diametrically opposed to Yira and Gvura, to fear and to heroism or to retreat. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not actually opposites at all, but truthfully, they are complementary. And that there is somehow a revolving cycle where Yira gives birth to Chesed, Chesed gives birth to Yira, Yira gives birth to Chesed, again and again, a cycle where one actually leads into the other and complements the other, rather than being viewed as mutually exclusive or as opposite as they might be in other realms other than the spiritual. The Gedalyahu says, V'ha'emes hu ki b'inyanei avodas Hashem, when it comes to matters of serving God, of spirituality, hayira moledes es ha'ava. Yira gives birth to Ava. Fear gives birth to love. V'chein lehipuch, Ava moledes es hayira. And the opposite is also true, that love gives birth to fear as well. Why? Ki mitoch rov ahava Hashem yisbarach nismaleha adam yira gedola she'eno rote lahafsik midvekuso. That through the great love that a person can have for Hashem, they come to truly appreciate the expansiveness of God and come to a feeling of awe of God, of reverence of God, of yiras Hashem, and to the feeling that they never want to let that go. In a true relationship with Hashem, you become so engrossed in Hashem as this masterful, unbelievable being that you begin to develop an awe that goes along with it and complements it and is born out of it rather than something that is contradictory to it. This actually helps us, according to the Gedalyahu, explain a pasuk in the story of the Akedah, which is a little bit curious. Pasuk says at the end of the Akedah, Ataya dati ki yirei Elokim ata. Now I know, says God, that you, Avraham, are a true Yirei Elokim. The reason it's curious is because we don't know Avram to be a true Yirei Elokim. We seem to see him as a person of Chesed, as a person of Ava, and he comes to the experience of the Akedah still giving so much that he's able to even give over his son. If we were come to some realization, it should have been, I see, Avraham, that your whole life of chesed and of giving and of avas Hashem is so true that you gave Ava in the ultimate way. You gave up your son lovingly to come to the Akedah. Something, of course, very difficult for us to even understand, but perhaps that would have been the natural thought about the outcome of the Akedah. Gedalyahu says, no, this pasuk now makes perfect sense to point out the yira of Avraham and not the Ava, not the chesed. Acha kavana shebemaaseh ha'akedah nisbarer ki ha'ava shel Avram Avinu alav shalom mekorahi mitoch yira. We finally understood in the moment of the Akedah, which was a moment of awe, and a moment of retreat, and a moment of fear, we finally understood that any yira that Avram had in his life was born from the chesed that was the totality of his personality. One gave rise to the next, one gave birth to the next, one was just a natural outgrowth of the other. Now he says, we could perhaps understand the redundancy of our pasuk. Mefarish hasvas emes kavanas hakasav. The Svas Emes explains the first pasuk in our parsha of Toldot, Yitzchak ben Avraham, as being not just a description of the birth of Yitzchak, or that Yitzchak was the son of Avram. Avram holid es Yitzchak in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense. Midas hayira shel Yitzchak, hu ben Avraham. The trait of yira, of fear of God, of awe of God, of retreat, sometimes, that was so characteristic of Yitzchak, was not in opposition to Avram, who represents Midas HaChesed, the more expansive personality, but rather one was born out of the next. Hamidas HaChesed shel Avram holid yira hazos. The Chesed of Avraham bore the yira of Yitzchak. Pasuk is telling us that these two traits are not mutually exclusive in the spiritual realm, but very much connected. And cyclical, I would say as well. That we learn from the Akedah that Avraham's journey perhaps begins in Yira, in some awe of a God that is a one God as opposed to many gods, as a God that's unseen as opposed to the idols of his time. That leads to an unbelievable Ava that captured the entirety of his life, an unbelievable love and expansiveness and chesed. And then that ultimately leads to the birth of Yitzchak, whose trait was Yira, because it's all cyclical. Yira leads to chesed, to Ava, and then Ava leads back to Yira. One leads into another, very much complementary. And actually, when you think about it, it's not surprising. It's captured very clearly in the first couple of lines of the second chapter of Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah in the Rambam. The Rambam very famously describes the two mitzvahs of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, love of God and fear of God. And he says, Heichi aderech lahavaso v'yiraso. What's the path to love God and fear God? How do these two things work? And he says, one is born out of the next. Bishash yisponena ada b'masa v'bruav haniflaim hagedolim v'yire mehem chachmaso she'en la'erech v'lo kates. When you start to see the creation of God that is so awesome and so unbelievable, right? You start with a little bit of yira, perhaps, a little bit of awe of what is all this about? Then miyad hu ohev, u'mishabeach, u'mifa'er, u'misaveh tava gedola leidas shem hagadol. You immediately feel filled with love because you want to discover more about this God. You want to relate more to this God. You want to praise this God more. That's the first stage. Then he says, "Ukemechashiv bidvarim ha'elu atzman, miyad hu nirta le'achorav v'yifached." But after the love stage, when you start to contemplate in further depth this greatness of God, you take a step back in awe, in yira, in retreat, and say, wow, even in my ava stage, I never truly realized how awesome, how great, how beyond me God really is. So that a little bit of yira leads to ava, and that great ava leads back to yira, and I believe that cycle continues. I think the Gedalyahu and the Sfas Emes give us not only interesting insight into the redundancy of the first pasuk in this week's Parsha, telling us Avram Holidas Yitzchak means in the spiritual sense that Avram's yira gave rise to the chesed of Yitzchak, but also gives us great insight into these two important traits in our own avodas Hashem, in our own service of God, telling us that this is a constantly evolving cycle of ava yira, ava yira, ava yira, and that no matter where you enter on that wheel, on that circle, on that cycle, is okay. You enter in the ava stage, it's great. You'll gain ava, eventually you'll surely gain yira. You enter in the yira stage, great. You'll gain yira and eventually you'll gain ava. These two traits go so much together in the spiritual realm that you're almost guaranteed to be able to have both because one bears the other. One gives rise to the other. And therefore, our entry points can be different, but in the end, we all end up in the same place, which is hopefully, God willing, with an unbelievable sense of the greatness of God and the awesomeness of God, which we retreat from a little bit. And of course, the love of God and expansiveness of God that we want to come closer to. Shabbat Shalom.